The best humans have not been produced yet.
What we want to find is what genes could be associated with high intelligence people.
It is exciting because we don't know what we will find.
Oh, it is really like being a mom. Yes, this is life that I created.
We'll have much finer control over the types of people that are born in the future.
Congratulations.
Well, what about the interview?
That was it.
I got it.
Of course you got it.
And that's the way it was. Each day I would dispose of as much loose skin, fingernails, and hair as possible to limit how much of my invalid self I would leave in the valid world. At the same time, Eugene prepared samples of his own superior body matter so that I might pass for him. Customized urine pouches for the frequent substance tests, fingertip blood sachets for security checks, and vials filled with other traces. While Eugene supplied me with a new identity, I paid the rent and kept him in the style to which he'd become accustomed. Eugene never suffered from the routine discrimination of a utero, a faith birth, or invalid, as we were called. A valid, a vitro, a made man. He suffered under a different burden, the burden of perfection. I was now a member of a relatively new and particularly detested segment of society. One of those who refuses to play the hand that he was dealt. I am most commonly known as a borrowed ladder, or a degenerate.
In the event that I am reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus in order to contribute something to solve overpopulation. Prince Philip, reported by Deutsche Presse-Agentur, DPA, August 1988.
So this is a talk about gene drives. I'm going to start by telling you a brief story. 20 years ago, a biologist named Anthony James got obsessed with the idea of making mosquitoes that didn't transmit malaria. It was a great idea, and pretty much a complete failure. For one thing, it turned out to be really hard to make a malaria-resistant mosquito. James managed it finally, just a few years ago, by adding some genes that make it impossible for the malaria parasite to survive inside the mosquito. But that just created another problem. Now that you've got a malaria-resistant mosquito, how do you get it to replace all the malaria-carrying mosquitoes? There were a couple options, but plan A was basically to breed up a bunch of the new genetically engineered mosquitoes, release them into the wild, and hope that they pass on their genes. The problem was that you'd have to release literally 10 times the number of native mosquitoes for that to work. So in a village with 10,000 mosquitoes, you'd release an extra 100,000. As you might guess, this was not a very popular strategy with the villagers. Then, last January, Anthony James got an email from a biologist named Ethan Beer. Beer said that he and his grad student, Valentino Gantz, had stumbled on a tool that could not only guarantee that a particular genetic trait would be inherited, but that would spread incredibly quickly. If they were right, it would basically solve the problem that James had been working on for 20 years. As a test, they engineered 2 mosquitoes to carry the anti-malaria gene, and also this new tool, a gene drive, which I'll explain in a minute. Finally, they set it up so that any mosquitoes that inherited the anti-malaria gene wouldn't have the usual white eyes, but would instead have red eyes. That was pretty much just for convenience. They could tell at a glance which was which. So they took their 2 anti-malarial red-eyed mosquitoes, put them in a box with 30 ordinary white-eyed ones, and let them breed. In 2 generations, those had produced 3,800 grandchildren. That is not the surprising part. This is the surprising part. Given that you started with just 2 red-eyed mosquitoes and 30 white-eyed ones, you'd expect mostly white-eyed descendants. Instead, when James opened the box, all 3,800 mosquitoes had red eyes. When I asked Ethan Beer about this moment, he became so excited that he was literally shouting into the phone. That's because getting only red-eyed mosquitoes violates a rule that is the absolute cornerstone of biology, Mendelian genetics. I'll keep this quick, but Mendelian genetics says that when a male and female mate, their baby inherits half of its DNA from each parent. So if our original mosquito was AA and our new mosquito was AB, where B is the anti-malaria gene, the babies should come out in 4 permutations: AA, AB, AA, BA. Instead, with the new gene drive, they all came out AB. Biologically, that shouldn't even be possible. So what happened? The first thing that happened was the arrival of a gene editing tool known as CRISPR in 2012. Many of you have probably heard about CRISPR, so I'll just say briefly that CRISPR is a tool that allows researchers to edit genes very precisely and easily and quickly. It does this by harnessing a mechanism that already existed in bacteria. Basically, there's a protein that acts like a scissors and cuts the DNA, and there's an RNA molecule that directs the scissors to any point on the genome you want. The result is basically a word processor for genes. You can take an entire gene out, put one in, or even edit just a single letter within a gene. And you can do it in nearly any species. Okay, remember how I said that gene drives originally had 2 problems? The first was that it was hard to engineer a mosquito to be malaria resistant. That's basically gone now, thanks to CRISPR. But the other problem was logistical. How do you get your trait to spread? This is where it gets clever. A couple years ago, a biologist at Harvard named Kevin Esvelt wondered what would happen if you made it so that CRISPR inserted not only your new gene, but also the machinery that does the cutting and pasting. In other words, what if CRISPR also copied and pasted itself? You'd end up with a perpetual motion machine for gene editing. And that's exactly what happened. This CRISPR gene drive that Esvelt created not only guarantees that a trait will get passed on, but if it's used in the germline cells, it will automatically copy and paste your new gene into both chromosomes of every single individual. It's like a global search and replace, or in science terms, it makes a heterozygous trait homozygous. So, what does this mean? For one thing, it means that we have a very powerful, but also somewhat alarming new tool. Up until now, the fact that gene drives didn't work very well was actually kind of a relief. Normally, when we mess around with an organism's genes, we make that thing less evolutionarily fit. So biologists can make all the mutant fruit flies they want without worrying about it. If some escape, natural selection just takes care of them. What's remarkable and powerful and frightening about gene drives is that that will no longer be true. Assuming that your trait does not have a big evolutionary handicap, like a mosquito that can't fly, the CRISPR-based gene drive will spread the change relentlessly until it is in every single individual in the population. Now, it isn't easy to make a gene drive that works that well, but James and Esvelt think that we can. The good news is that this opens the door to some remarkable things. If you put an anti-malarial gene drive in just 1% of Anopheles mosquitoes, the species that transmits malaria, researchers estimate that it would spread to the entire population in a year. So in a year, you could virtually eliminate malaria. In practice, we're still a few years out from being able to do that, but still, 1,000 children a day die of malaria. In a year, that number could be almost 0. The same goes for dengue fever, chikungunya, yellow fever. And it gets better. Say you want to get rid of an invasive species, like get Asian carp out of the Great Lakes. All you have to do is release a gene drive that makes the fish produce only male offspring. In a few generations, there'll be no females left. No more carp. In theory, this means we could restore hundreds of native species that have been pushed to the brink. Okay, that's the good news. This is the bad news. Gene drives are so effective that even an accidental release could change an entire species, and often very quickly. Anthony James took good precautions. He bred his mosquitoes in a biocontainment lab, and he also used a species that's not native to the US, so that even if some did escape, they'd just die off. There'd be nothing for them to mate with. But it's also true that if a dozen Asian carp with the all-male gene drive accidentally got carried from the Great Lakes back to Asia, they could potentially wipe out the native Asian carp population. And that's not so unlikely, given how connected our world is. In fact, it's why we have an invasive species problem. And that's fish. Things like mosquitoes and fruit flies, there's literally no way to contain them. They cross borders and oceans all the time. Okay, the other piece of bad news is that a gene drive might not stay confined to what we call the target species. That's because of gene flow, which is basically a fancy way of saying that neighboring species sometimes interbreed. If that happens, it's possible a gene drive could cross over, like Asian carp could infect some other kind of carp. That's not so bad if your drive just promotes a trait, like eye color. In fact, there's a decent chance that we'll see a wave of very weird fruit flies in the near future. But it could be a disaster if your drive is designed to eliminate the species entirely. The last worrisome thing is that the technology to do this, to genetically engineer an organism and include a gene drive, is something that basically any lab in the world can do. An undergraduate can do it. A talented high schooler with some equipment can do it. Now, I'm guessing that this sounds terrifying. Interestingly, though, nearly every scientist I talked to seemed to think that gene drives were not actually that frightening or dangerous. Partly that's because they believe that scientists will be very cautious and responsible about using them. So far, that's been true. But gene drives also have some actual limitations. So for one thing, they work only in sexually reproducing species, so thank goodness, they can't be used to engineer viruses or bacteria. Also, the trait spreads only with each successive generation. So changing or eliminating a population is practical only if that species has a fast reproductive cycle, like insects or maybe small vertebrates like mice and fish. In elephants or people, it would take centuries for a trait to spread widely enough to matter. Also, even with CRISPR, it's not that easy to engineer a truly devastating trait. Say you wanted to make a fruit fly that feeds on ordinary fruit instead of rotting fruit with the aim of sabotaging American agriculture. First, you'd have to figure out which genes control what the fruit fly wants to eat, which is already a very long and complicated project. Then you'd have to alter those genes to change the fly's behavior to wherever you want it to be, which is an even longer and more complicated project. And it might not even work because the genes that control behavior are complex. So if you're a terrorist and have to choose between starting a grueling basic research program that will require years of meticulous lab work and still might not pan out, or just blowing stuff up, you'll probably choose the latter. This is especially true because, at least in theory, it should be pretty easy to build what's called a reversal drive. That's one that basically overwrites the change made by the first gene drive. So if you don't like the effects of a change, you can just release a second drive that will cancel it out, at least in theory. Okay, so where does this leave us? We now have the ability to change entire species at will. Should we? Are we gods now? I'm not sure I'd say that, but I would say this. First, some very smart people are even now debating how to regulate gene drives. At the same time, some other very smart people are working hard to create safeguards, like gene drives that self-regulate or peter out after a few generations. That's great. But this technology still requires a conversation. And given the nature of gene drives, that conversation has to be global. What if Kenya wants to use a drive, but Tanzania doesn't? Who decides whether to release a gene drive that can fly? I don't have the answer to that question. All we can do going forward, I think, is talk honestly about the risks and benefits, and take responsibility for our choices. By that I mean not just the choice to use a gene drive, but also the choice not to use one. Humans have a tendency to assume that the safest option is to preserve the status quo. But that's not always the case. Gene drives have risks, and those need to be discussed. But malaria exists now and kills 1,000 people a day. To combat it, we spray pesticides that do grave damage to other species, including amphibians and birds. So when you hear about gene drives in the coming months, And trust me, you will be hearing about them. Remember that. It can be frightening to act, but sometimes not acting is worse.
Good afternoon.
Mr. and Mrs. Holt, Mr. Vance.
Mr. Holt. How do you do? How do you do? Mrs. Holt, welcome. Welcome to new life. Please, sit down. Right over here. Make yourself at home. We're so delighted to have you.
Thank you very much. Very careful.
Now, see, you're 79 years old, Mr. Holt.
Yes.
And you, Mrs. Holt?
I'm 74. I was 74 last May.
Well, let's just take a look at the medical history. Great deal of sickness, Mr. Holt.
Some?
Sorry to hear that. Are you in pain now?
Some?
He's in great pain. It's fairly constant now. It doesn't seem to let up.
Which is one of the reasons the New Life Corporation is in existence. We alleviate pain, Mr. and Mrs. Holt.
Oh?
We make it a thing of the past. Do you know what we deal in?
No.
We deal in youth, Mr. and Mrs. Holt. We deal in new life. Yes.
New?
Our stock in trade is simply rebirth.
Rebirth.
Could you tell us what is involved?
Easily. The process is quick and painless. Now, we've constructed other bodies. Bodies that are perfect in composition, concept, construction. Physiologically and psychologically, you'll find that you're just as you are now, but in a different body, a younger body in the prime of health, physically and emotionally close to perfection. The lifespan of any one of our human receptacles is roughly 112 years.
100?
Tell me, my dears, how long have you been married?
50 years.
A rich life. A happy one. A full one, I'm sure, and you don't want this relationship to end.
No, Mr. Vance, it can't end. Marie is... She's all I've got. She's all I care about, you see. You're quite right, Mr. Vance. It cannot end.
Of course. Well, now, why don't I show you some of the models we have?
Models?
Yes.
Models?
So that you can select two that appeal to you.
All right.
Come with me.
Let's have a look at the models.
Wonderful.
Do you want to live forever? Do you want to get away from illness, hurt, anything that doesn't work the way it's supposed to? We have achieved that here. This is called the cortical stack. This cortical stack stores your memories, everything that makes you you, mannerisms, emotions you ever felt, people you know, anything, even your consciousness is stored on this device. We did not create this device, but we do use it to help our sleeves move. Sleeves are basically human bodies we grow in our labs. They're organically real. Bones, tissue, organs, everything. These are the best bodies you'll ever have, period. Nothing can hurt these bodies, but they are human. So if something were to happen to them, you can always change them out for a new one. That's why it says immortality becomes non-existent. Because you can be 50 in one body and change to the next body. You're as young as you feel. If you come this way, David's going to show you some 2018 models that you can choose from.
Well, here you can choose which sleeve you desire. Now you can either have the sleeve that you have right now, or we have a selection of wonderful sleeves that we have made through Psychosec, fully genuine and organic produced. Now if you'd like to be taller, shorter, skinnier, if you'd like to have better vision, maybe strengthen your body, you have the choice to choose a man or a woman's sleeve. Now, if your sleeve becomes damaged or too old for your liking, simply remove from the cortical stack your DHF, your consciousness, to another, newer sleeve. Any questions?
Am I in a Banksy exhibit?
Excuse me?
Is this a Banksy exhibit?
This is not, this is Psychosynth. We have the technology for you to achieve immortality. Now, this is the final stage. Come right this way.
Psychosynth. Now this is the final stage of the resleeving process. This is Joel. Now remember guys, Joel is made up of exactly what we're made of. Skin, bone, muscle, tissue, everything is in Joel. He still needs to have his nutrients. He still needs to breathe, okay? Just like we do on a day-to-day basis. But Joel is in an unconscious state. So his cortical stack is waiting for someone's mind to be needle casted into his cortical stack. So basically he's being prepped for your mind to be in his body. So come closer, get closer. If you guys would like to know more, I'm going to go live on February 2nd.
Hi, this is Nicholson 1968. Hope you're doing well. Making this video called Playing God, the Role of a Lifetime. And the reason I put this together is kind of a greatest hits kind of thing of things I've done, but I'm going to put it together for you. For you out there that are into conspiracies, you'll understand this video quite well. And for those out there that want to share this for people that are totally asleep, hopefully this will help wake them up. But the reason I do call this Playing God, a Role of a Lifetime is that is what is going on all around us all the time. It is an enemy of humanity, not an enemy against Christianity or a race of people, a religion, a nation. It is the enemy, true enemy of humanity. If you look around you from that perspective, you can clearly see that the enemy is trying to modify humanity. They've already started modifying food, modifying the weather, geoengineering it, also using the weather as a weapon. Can cause hurricanes, cause earthquakes in certain places of the world. A lot of people thought that was science, just science fiction or conspiracy years ago, just like they thought fluoride in our drinking water was a conspiracy. Now that's pretty out in the open. So there's a lot of things that people are waking up to that's hard for them to hear now that you may think is a conspiracy, but later on, as we uncover things, we find out that it's not conspiracy. It's just waking up people in areas of the world, using the alternative media to do that, because we know that the media and the movies presented to us on the mainstream television are propaganda. So I'm putting this together, and I hope you enjoy it. It's going to show you chemtrails, going to show you Cube, Saturn, Satan worship. You better start understanding what that means and where it comes from, because the knowledge that is being shared to the secret societies, to the evil men on the face of this earth, where that technology is coming from. It's not coming from the minds of men. And it goes back to Ephesians 6:12, is the things that we're battling are not necessarily flesh and blood. They are principalities of things on high in dark realms. And that's exactly what is going on. Call it what you will. Satanism, the Nephilim from the fallen, things that are hurting humanity, that a lot of people, and get this, listen to me very carefully, a lot of people think they're doing good by genetically modifying food, genetically modifying your genes, and all of this stuff that's going on. But eventually where it's going to lead to, like everything else, just like the technology of the internet and the computer, it can be used for good, but ultimately it'll be used for evil against us, where technology is taken too far. The modifying of your genes will be taken too far and used against you, like most of the stuff. So lastly, I will finish up this video with some symbolism in a video Of course, I take a video that's out there that's telling you a message that the mass of people look at it and go, wow, that is a cool video. But I take it and decode it back to you, and it's telling you a very, very important message, and that the masses just don't see. But the people with eyes to see will see, and the ears to hear will hear. So, appreciate you. This is Nicholson 1968. Please enjoy.
The operator brings the satellite into focus on the two storms, one centered over Kansas, the other over Labrador.
Changing to northeastern low, L21.
With the touch of a button, the battle begins. On the ground, chemical cloud seeders begin to work the two storm areas. Robot planes seed the clouds from above. The storm centers over Kansas and over Labrador intensify as seeding continues.
Now changing over to Hurricane Center H8.
The fury of the hurricane mounts as 100-mile-an-hour winds lash the sea to a foaming frenzy.
All stations, Sector C. Activate Phase 2, Control Plan Delta. Set vapor rockets for 42,000 feet.
As an emergency measure, the controller calls for a salvo of vapor rockets to be fired ahead of the path the hurricane is predicted to take. These artificial clouds will block the sun from evaporating more water to feed the hurricane. The reports coming into the control center indicate that the diversionary cloud seeding over Kansas is now creating a flood danger.
Well, part of my job in bioenvironmental engineering was to approve hazardous materials that came on the base. I sat at a computer and I approved those hazardous materials on base and tied them to a process and a building. So when I started approving what is called an Air Force Form 3952, the approval of hazardous materials, and I started seeing barium, aluminum oxide, and strontium come on the base from a contractor whose name was not listed, which was not normal. I started to realize that those crazy tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorists might not be so crazy. I lived about less than a mile behind the flight line at Tinker Air Force Base, Oklahoma, in Oklahoma City. I lived about less than a mile behind the flight line at Tinker Air Force Base, Oklahoma, in Oklahoma City. At Tinker Air Force Base, Oklahoma, in Oklahoma City. And due to my background as an industrial hygienist and an environmental specialist, I conducted soil grid sampling and grain sampling. Those of you who may not be too privy to chemistry, you know that there's natural elements occurring in Earth. Aluminum is one of them. However, barium, radioactive, and strontium are not. So I conducted those samples and saw limits in my community that would make your head spin. And I started to realize that those peers within my professional community that were trying to wake those of us in the military up were right.
Despite the cost, however, NASA does need to test these engines once in a while. So they built this place in the wetlands of Mississippi. This gave them an imaginary boundary line, and anyone living on the inside of it was offered a simple choice. Stay, and you'll never hear another television program as long as you live. Or take the NASA shilling and get out. Stay, and you'll never hear another television program as long as you live. Or take the NASA shilling and get out. No one stayed. And NASA ended up with exactly what it wanted. 125,000 acres of nothing. They even had to move 5 cemeteries, because the noise they were planning on making would wake the dead. Don't worry if you can't hear what I'm saying. I couldn't even hear myself. This is the loudest sound you could possibly conceive. And as it turns out, the cleanest. Now, the most amazing thing is that that cloud up there, which was generated by the engine, is just a mixture of hydrogen and oxygen. It's water vapor. And in about an hour's time, someone in Mississippi is going to get wet washing. It will actually rain. I told you, it's raining. That's unbelievable. Oh. NASA's playing God. That's unbelievable. Oh. NASA's playing God. It's making its own weather.
So that was an example of NASA's weather modifying device. They sell it as a engine testing device, but as you can clearly see, it's made to modify weather. It's known as a wet surface air cooler. These devices are all around the world and are used to manipulate and control the weather from the ground. Most of us are aware of geoengineering from the skies. We look up, we see that the skies are being painted much more. The geoengineering chemtrails include aluminum, barium, strontium, formaldehyde. They also will spray chemtrail flu to make people sick to help Big Pharma.
The Niagara Wet Surface Air Cooler, or WSAC, is a heat removal device used to efficiently and reliably cool or condense various liquids or gases. One way of describing how a WSAC works is to compare it to a typical shell and tube heat exchanger. A shell and tube is a sensible cooling device where the process stream being cooled is on one side of the tubes and the cooling water, normally from a cooling tower, is on the other side. If you remove the shell, expose the bare tubes, spray water and induce air over the tube surfaces, you now have an evaporative heat transfer device known as a wet surface air cooler. Here is a typical wet surface air cooler system. The process stream to be cooled or condensed flows inside specially designed tube bundles. Water is sprayed over the outside of the tubes, and air is induced over the bundles in a co-current direction using fans.
People have actually known you could do these things, for better or for worse, for decades, actually since the 60s. I think the reason I've occasionally said that is that it illustrates the kind of power that this technology grants us. And I think, for better or for worse, what this technology gives us is this enormous kind of leverage and power to alter the climate, and to do it with a very small amount of money or material. And that power should frighten us, I think, and it presents real deep problems for governance. So for sure, there are a bunch of dangers. There are both the dangers of kind of side effects like ozone loss or interfering with atmospheric chemistry in other ways. There's the basic fact that this is not a perfect compensation for CO2. So for example, carbon dioxide makes the ocean more acidic, and doing these things to cool the planet will do nothing to correct that.
Let's talk about the risks of actually doing it on a global scale, because you've been pretty frank about that. You've actually said you could easily imagine a chain of events that would extinguish life on Earth. Now, what would be that potential chain of events from using this kind of technology?
Carbon dioxide makes the ocean more acidic, and doing these things to cool the planet will do nothing to correct that.
Let's talk about the risks of actually doing it on a global scale, because you've been pretty frank about that. You've actually said you could easily imagine a chain of events that would extinguish life on Earth. Now, what would be that potential chain of events from using this kind of technology?
If you talk about putting sulfates or some other engineered particle in the stratosphere, the issue is that a very small number of people in principle could do it and have this kind of huge leverage to affect the whole climate in this profound way. And that's what raises the very hard challenge of governance. The actual materials you need, let's say the aircraft and engineering you need to do this, are something that would be in reach easily of any of the G20 states. It's not hard to do. You could buy the equipment from many aeronautical contractors. But I think there are also kinds of unilateralism where you're not formally doing it in a legal multinational way, but where you do it with lots of consultation. And in that situation, what might happen is a small number of countries might do it. At this point, we have no regulatory structure whatsoever and no treaty structure, so it's really unclear how such a thing would be controlled. And one thing that research may show is that this doesn't work as well as we think.
When I saw the State of the Black Union, Dick Gregory really moved me and a lot of my friends. I show it to everybody that comes over the house, especially white folks, because they need to hear that, so that they know more about all of us. Because what he said affects all of us. He said something that really hit home about this phenomena of chemtrails. And, when I was a kid, I used to see these trails in the sky all the time. And so, oh, that's cool. A jet just went over. And then you started to see a whole bunch of them. And the next thing you know, everybody in your neighborhood was fighting and arguing, and you didn't know why. Okay? And you really didn't know why. I mean, everybody was fighting. So he started riffing about the chemtrails, and he started to say things that hit home so hard. And I would recommend that everybody try to get what he said online or wherever.
So the thing about what's going on now is, how big is the big picture? And I used to think that if you went outside the box, you could see more. And a lot of people believe that this settles at the level of power and control. That if they have all the power, they have all the control, that's what they want. There's actually something beyond that, and that's what I've started to explore. Could it be that artificial materials are being introduced into living things? Here you have, this comes from the nanotech industry. It's what I call the nanotech pyramid. You start with materials, you go up to structures, processes, and devices. Could it be that artificial materials are being introduced into us to create new processes from the ground up, which processes will override our own natural biology, our own internal systems? Nanoarrays are these tiny devices that are used for DNA hybridization. So what processes are going on here? Are these materials combining to form devices that are working together inside us? What is happening to our biology? And remember that tissue samples obtained from ordinary people who have no Morgellons symptoms, no lesions, can be cultured to produce the very same filaments found in people with Morgellons. So we would have to conclude that Morgellons is like the canary in the coal mine, and that only some people are exuding the materials. And could that be because their bodies are rejecting it, while our bodies are integrating it? Jan's body has been sending out these plaques, colored plaques, which are hard pieces of silica. Some of them have these dots on them. They're very small. They require handling with a needle as she places them under a microscope. The plaques are fragile. They can shatter. Quantum dots, which are the colors you see, are nanocrystal semiconductors made of heavy metals surrounded by an organic shell. Now I want you to remember some of these terms. Heavy metals, okay? Heavy metals, aluminum and so forth. So these are nanocrystal semiconductors surrounded by an organic shell, but they are made of heavy metals. And Morgellon subjects are also finding this stuff. Jewel-like hexagons, faceted pyramids, crystals. Hexagons have shown up environmentally, not only in tissues, but they are in environmental fallout. This specimen is provided by Morgellons Research Group, and we have a table here this weekend. Mike and Jennifer from Morgellons Research Group. Just as we're being sold on the idea of a smart environment, a techno matrix that will vibrate with not just intelligence but connection. What indeed is the World Wide Web? We may think it's the internet, but it will be the humming network of everything connected through ubiquitous intelligence, intelligence that is everywhere. Artificial intelligence will connect the world. Homo sapien will be transformed into Homo evolutus. Biological processes will be run by technology. Living things will not be reproductive. The earth will be populated with engineered species, and all processes will be patented, licensed, and controlled. You could consider nanotechnology the installation of artificial intelligence in living and non-living things. Smart dust and smart motes, for instance, are tiny nanosensors that can float and land anywhere. As Kurzweil declares, self-replicating nanotechnology will infuse everything around us with itself.
I wipe my brow and I spread my rust. I'm breathing in the chemicals. I'm breaking in, shaping up, and checking out on the prisoners. This is it, the apocalypse. Whoa. Don my clothes, it's a revolution, I suppose. We're painted red to fit right in. Whoa. I'm breaking in, shaping up, and checking out on the prisoners. This is it, the apocalypse. I'm waking up.
it's obvious now that artists are supposed to own their master recordings. I mean, in the future, it'll be unconscionable to even think you can take somebody's creation and claim ownership of it. See, unfortunately, this discussion is going to start to barrel into a discussion about the human genome and the DNA and all the rest of it. When it gets there, then we're going to be in the deep water. See, so it's better to start the conversation now before we get into God talk.